So, revision of the meta-narratives of Scotland's social and cultural development across the late antique Little Ice Age, the medieval climate anomaly, and the Little Ice Age, as I've explored over the course of this weekend, is opening new perspectives on the interplay of human and natural processes that shaped our national history. What we have seen, albeit through close focus on just 4 key themes and with deep dives into a few episodes across a span of 13 centuries, is a record largely of resilience in the face of dramatic and occasionally catastrophic changes in climate and weather it produces, in the wider environment that is framed by the interplay of climate and weather, and in human cultural and technical responses to that interplay. And the central point in all of this has been that it is a question of responses. Human agency and free will mean that individual and societal action can lead to wholly different results. Choices can and did produce both positive and negative outcomes, in some cases leading into rigidity traps where patterns of behaviour become locked in and render it impossible to take a different course, or path dependency, where the experience of past choices shape future decisions. But they can also lead to wholly different outcomes, beneficial development that sets individuals, communities, and whole nations on a new trajectory that breaks the shackles of failing practices. Climatic and environmental change is emphatically not the determinant of human destiny. What mattered was how our ancestors chose to respond in the face of crises delivered by these processes. In a society on the European margins, often teetering on the knife edge of sustainability, the environmental turn explored in these lectures enables us to see the narrowly escaped dependency and rigidity traps and the profundity of change that delivered survival, but at a cost whose legacy remains with us. Throughout the exploration of the 4 main themes, we have seen behaviours and actions that reflect active attempts to solve issues that arose from the interplay of human cultural practices and the effects of changing weather and resource depletion. As we have seen, there is no simple narrative of cause and effect, no silver bullet solutions, just choices and actions that had outcomes, some of which were immediately evident, others, the ramifications of which we are still coming to terms with today. It is important to recognise that most of the choices made were not the result of strategic plans and policy making, but arose from countless individual decisions based as often on personal preference, guesswork and prayer as an observation and experiment. It is also important to acknowledge that most of the decisions we have explored did not lead to immediate and decisive change, but started transitions that might take years, if not decades, to deliver visible results. And that fact serves to remind us too that the circumstances to which these actions were a response were rarely short, sharp shocks, but slow and incremental. Headline episodes of extreme weather events apart, climate change was most often experienced as almost imperceptible annual movements in mean temperatures and precipitation levels that crept towards tipping points that marked the decisive points when traditional crops started to fail more often than not, when grass started to grow earlier or later in the spring, livestock could no longer be wintered outdoors, or migration of fish shoals happened or didn't. That is the reality beneath the theory of slow violence, of the progressive erosion or degradation of environmental conditions, usually imperceptible, but cumulatively diminishing the well-being of human, animal, and plant populations. It is the reality of constantly shifting baselines, where each generation might notice difference over the long passage of time, but where from year to year there was little sign that growing seasons were changing, the availability of peat was declining, woodland was shrinking, until suddenly old certainties no longer applied. Traditional environmental knowledge became meaningless, and short-term problems suddenly became crises. To draw together all the strands and explore these topics in the round, I shall make one last deep dive into the 1st century of the Little Ice Age. How, if at all, did the people of early 15th century Scotland, a period of social, political and economic disturbance, experience and understand the beginning of this new climate era? This is the period often characterised in graphic terms, in the words of later 15th century poet William Dunbar, as, quote, "the dirk and drublie days, when sable all the heaven arrays, with misty vapours, clouds and skies, nature all courage me denies." Doomists take note. Extreme weather events are usually the most headline-grabbing of historical records for climate change. But for Scotland in the 1400s, weather records from any historical sources, chronicles, charters, royal administrative or financial records, estate rentals and so on, are sparse. Nevertheless, material from geographically widespread locations in mainland Britain and Ireland can throw light on general trends from which we build models for how different parts of Scotland fared at those times. Collectively, the kinds of events described in such sources, coupled with proxy climate data, indicate that a major systemic shift was underway across the North Atlantic by around 1400. Climatologists suggest this shift led, among other things, to a reversal of trends in North Atlantic weather towards a degree of storminess unseen since the 800s, and to an abrupt deterioration in weather conditions. What that meant was more frequent storms and an increase in their violence, with the exposed Atlantic coasts, western and northern isles affected worst, but with the North Sea coast battered by intensifying northerly and easterly tempests. With this rising storminess came higher levels of precipitation generally, but with storms leading to greater flooding and waterlogging of land or producing deep snow cover that prevented cultivation, blanketed winter grazing and smothered livestock. Some of the impacts took many years to manifest themselves. For example, the lowering of altitudinal tree lines through poorer seeding, germination and growing conditions, and threat of windcast or limb loss in storm events, were as likely to have been outcomes of the colder and, critically, wetter conditions in the early decades of the Little Ice Age as are suggested to have been in prehistory. While farmers might be acutely aware of poorer crop growth in the annual cycles of sowing, growing and harvest, the slower growth or regeneration of woodland might not have been so immediately recognisable. All such trends could be endured, but when it became clear that they had become the new normal in the weather, Scotland's people did not remain passive victims, but adapted their practices to the new conditions. All our documentary sources record deteriorating weather down the Atlantic facing west of the British Isles from around 1405 to 7. The first significant event was recorded for 1405 in accounts of very rainy and tempestuous weather in winter, which caused extensive property damage in western districts. The year 1407 was reported as blighted by similarly poor conditions with high weather-related losses among the livestock that was the mainstay of the economies of the regions worst hit by the weather. The Atlantic seaboard experience, however, was not representative of elsewhere in Scotland. We lack any equivalent of the post-1660 weather and temperature reconstructions for central England, but abundant contemporary English records of the early 1400s, especially from southeastern districts, offer qualitative narratives with wide regional variation. Thomas Walsingham's chronicle, composed at St Albans, describes a bitterly cold and long-lasting winter with snow on the ground for 4 months, and then a late spring in 1408. His account describes what was for the southern British Isles its only truly extreme winter of a longer episode that affected Europe from France to Russia for some years after 1405. These long winters of extreme cold and precipitation brought the conditions immortalised in 1412 in the Limburg brothers' snowy February scene from the Trerish Ur. Chronicle references to extreme events, including hurricane-force winds in the 1410s, are seen through climate proxies as just one peak amid a generally upward trajectory of North Atlantic storminess. It was an outstanding episode amid progressively strengthening winds that was responsible for the spectacular sandblow events which overwhelmed areas of Machair cultivation from Neep in Lewis to Borth on Barra's west coast. Here, the 1410s began a decline that ended with the abandonment of several ancient settlements, like the Shalgari estate centre at the Utal in North Uist. High upland temperatures were symptomatic of a strongly positive summer NAO in 1419, which, after the precipitation of earlier years, brought drought. As experienced in the last decade, with the summer droughts in the Northwest Highlands, any significant drop in seasonal precipitation in this region can lead quickly to problems for human and animal populations, despite widespread popular perception of rain and boggy wetness associated with that region. Throughout the Highlands, as recent experience again exposes, dry conditions were problematical for both peasant communities and large estates whose flocks and herds were driven there for summer pasturing. Even some of the biggest watercourses in the Highlands are spate streams, strongly seasonal in character, whose flows rise and fall rapidly and dry up quickly, reducing watering options for livestock. But what was bad for the Highlands was not necessarily so for lowland districts. Warmth and low precipitation were perfect for an abundant wheat harvest. The climax of this first phase came in 1419, with the highest summer temperatures experienced in the Cairngorms since the 1370s, as recorded in the growth rings of the region's pines. After that, it cooled steeply and steadily into mid-century. During this phase, snow lingered on the highest summits and probably never melted in summer from north-facing corries. Winds from the Cairngorm Plateau remained bitterly cold, and the sustained low air temperatures, rarely breaching the essential 6 degrees C daytime temperature necessary for grass growth, delayed growth on upland summer pastures essential for short-range transhumance. There was also a negative impact on germination of trees and scrub seed across the Central Highlands. The 1420s also saw a switch in winter conditions in the Northwest Highlands, with the long run of high winter NAO ending abruptly with a return to the most pronounced low North Atlantic oscillation since the Oort minimum. Plummeting temperatures, first seen in winter 1422-3, became regular over the course of the next 30 years across most of northern Europe, from the Urals to Scandinavia. Entrenched cold deepened the impact of persistently wetter summers and autumns delivered on the continent by recurrent high summer NAO. But we have no corresponding report of similar severity in even Highland districts. For Bauer, from his Scottish East Coast perspective, there was nothing unusual in the weather to report beyond a spell of stormy conditions in autumn 1425. It is in non-narrative sources that we glimpse all not being quite so well, especially in upland districts north of the Tay. Is it a coincidence that there was a resurgence in the consciousnesses of many Scots of the threat of which little had been heard since the early 13th century, the wolf? Whilst the hunting of wolves ordained in 13th century deeds had brought their near eradication in southern Scotland, the evidence of the later 14th century English Goth map attests their abundance in the northwestern Highlands. As our largest apex predator after humans surviving into the later medieval period, it is likely that they had continued to compete with humans for prey within the deer-rich uplands. During harsher times, however, as experienced in the winters of the early 1400s when Bauer records high mortalities amongst wild animals, they probably turned to domestic livestock for food. It is in this context that we must see a 1428 Act of Parliament instructing barons to organise spring hunts to kill wolf whelps and to hold wolf hunts 4 times annually or as often as wolves were seen on their land. The reiteration of the legislation in 1458, following a second run of extreme winters, is not unexpected. But on this occasion, it was aimed explicitly at the destruction of the entire packs. Cumulatively, such material points to a zone of collision between humans and wolf packs in grazing areas along the interface between the Central Highland Massif and the neighbouring lowland zones. Collectively, most written and climate proxy records evidence a major cooling event commencing by the early 1430s at the latest and lasting for decades, with temperatures not again reaching 14th century highs until around 1490 to 1500. This switch is noted by Bauer, who observed that the eastern lowlands' first extreme winter came in 1431-2, although northern and western parts of Scotland had experienced poor winters through the previous decade. For him, that winter was, quote, particularly hard with ice and gales. It brought high cattle, sheep, and wild animal mortalities. It began a succession of very poor years, Bauer reporting fearfully cold weather, lasting 3.5 months, during which time even mill lades froze and prevented the milling of grain. Poor conditions across Ireland and western Scotland culminated in 1435, when he recorded dearth even in southeastern districts. It is evident that the winters were perceptibly colder, stormier, and longer, with growing seasons in spring and summer curtailed and harvests diminished. This was also one of the worst times for natural reseeding of woodland and the production of viable seed on mature trees, although the impact did not become visible until years, if not decades, after the coldest and wettest episode. With these blows to vital resource niches upon which human populations depended, it is no surprise that the 1430s introduced unwanted stress into human social relationships as the agricultural basis of the economy and access to grazing, woodland, peat, and seasonal fisheries contracted. It is hard not to see any part being played by the stresses of these early decades of the Little Ice Age in the political and economic tensions that ended with the assassination of King James I at Perth in the bitterly cold February of 1437. Returning to the proxy record, we see further evidence to reinforce the negative messages of the documentary sources. Down to 1450, the Trallegill speleothems suggest that severe winter weather prevailed down the western side of the country. Comparing the types of weather revealed in proxy and instrumentally recorded evidence from the Northwest Highlands and Eastern districts for the later 18th and early 19th centuries with this Trallegill proxy data for the 1400s, it is likely that this was the tracking east of successive waves of moisture-laden fronts from the Atlantic to meet intensely cold easterly airflow from the Siberian winter high-pressure cell. The instrumentally recorded and observed results in the 1810s to 1840s was heavy snowfall over northern and probably northeastern Scotland, and we might reasonably expect similar conditions in what were almost identical circumstances 4 centuries earlier. Tree ring data from the Cairngorms show a sharp drop in annual summer temperatures from around 1375, reaching its lowest level before 1410, but it then recovered somewhat between 1410 and 20. Even collectively and comparatively, it is still a slender and relatively blunt-edged evidence. But it sustains a view that Highland and Hebridean districts, if not all of Scotland, faced similar weather trends to the wider northern Atlantic and European region. Data from Trallegill indicates that low winter NAO persisted, delivering a more northerly airflow and colder conditions over the northern mainland and islands. The northern Cairngorm tree ring data suggests again cooler summer conditions. Once more, these data sets suggest adverse winter and summer conditions through the 1440s and into the 1450s, although the summertime mountain temperatures recovered after mid-1430s lows. There is a lag in the record of similar cooling in the bottom water temperature data from Loch Sunart, which you can see here, with the most rapid shift towards colder temperatures commencing about 1445 and extending into the 1490s. That lag suggests that any atmospheric warming had not delivered significant improvement in the wider weather regime of high rainfall that contributed to the lower salinity of the sea loch, which affected these temperatures. Can the consequences of this climate episode be traced elsewhere in documentary accounts? Parliamentary records confirm that poor harvests and consequent episodic shortages of victuals recurred in the 1450s, although details of specific incidences do not survive, and it is likely that dearth rather than full-blown famine was more common. The legislative evidence for continuing stresses starts with a January 1450 Act prohibiting hoarding of foodstuffs, which reflected a belief that such behaviour caused shortages rather than being a panicked reaction to them. Further legislation against hoarding in 1455 reveals persistent supply difficulties despite Parliament's efforts to legislate out of the crisis. Poor late autumn weather, which affected the harvest of late sown grain crops, is implicit in our one chronicle account of weather events, the Auchinleck Chronicles report of heavy rain in the western southern uplands in November 1453. The chronicler narrates how unprecedented rainfall brought extensive flooding in the valley bottom districts of Lower Clydesdale, but he does not mention explicitly loss of the grain crops. It is probably not entirely coincidental, however, that the 1454 Parliament legislated to encourage food imports. This evidence and further indication of extensive social dislocation and socio-economic distress from the later 1440s and 1450s suggest that the weather impact on food production were severe and long-lasting. We can perhaps see the Spörer minimum as worsening this phase of poor conditions through the mid and later 15th century. Certainly for Scotland, the worst episode occurred in a successive harvest failures in the 1480s as the solar minimum developed, with legislation in 1482 and 1486 revealing that urgent action was taken to relieve the threat of famine. In its timing, that legislation, after 3 decades of silence on such issues, hints at a recent and profound emergency. Volcanic forcing is postulated as adding to the intensity of switches in climate dynamics in this period and might explain why such measures happened then. A specific crisis event within a longer episode of climatic deterioration was possibly linked with the eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington state on the Pacific seaboard of the USA in 1479, with a secondary and smaller eruption in 1482. The first eruption was pyroclastic and expelled millions of tons of aerosol particulates into the high atmosphere, potentially reducing solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface and having similar effects to the 1257 Samalas eruption of Gunung Rinjani. Under normal circumstances, the impact might have been minimal, but in the already cooler conditions of the Spörer minimum, it was perhaps sufficient at northern latitudes to make the difference between marginal success and failure for the grain harvest while the dust lingered in the atmosphere. In Orkney's low-lying and sandy northern islands, this eruption was perhaps the catalyst in the potent mix of weather conditions and agricultural practices that brought the collapse in rental values from the 1480s onwards that I referred to earlier today. In the Western Isles, the increasing North Atlantic storminess contributed to substantial losses of land that had been prized for centuries for settlement and agriculture. Some was overwhelmed by sandblow, but more was washed away by the sea over frighteningly short periods. In the 1490s, persistent cells of winter and summer high pressure returned the weather to a sequence of cold, dry winters and dry summers, where already damaged fields were exposed to the perfect conditions to accelerate erosion of once productive land. The machers of the Uists and Benbecula in the Western Isles were affected badly, with rapid loss to the sea commencing around 1350. Settlements like Bornish and Kilfedder were abandoned in the later 14th and earlier 15th century in favour of the more physically secure locations on the rock and loch landscapes of the Uist Blacklands. Numerous researchers have written at length about Hisker, an island now 4 miles west of the present North Uist coast, but which was reputedly connected by a sandy spit to North Uist and Benbecula. This spit was destroyed in the first half of the century, leaving just the rocky outcrop of Hisker itself. Down the outer Hebridean Macher Strip, erosion of old land surfaces has continued, with associated exposure of human burials and settlement debris emerging from below sea-eroded dunes on, for example, the west side of Balashar, Yollagary on Barra and Shether on Sandray. Although they are mainly prehistoric and earlier medieval date, they suggest that tales of losses of the settled area to the sea are grounded in folk memory. Sandblow and erosion events, as discussed earlier today, also occurred on the east coast in the early 1400s. Local tradition records the overwhelming of the village of Forvey on the north side of the Eithne estuary in Aberdeenshire during a 9-day storm in 1413. Although neither that date nor event can be corroborated from surviving records, excavation in the 1950s confirmed an end to occupation around 1400. Through excavation, areas of rig and furrow cultivation were identified adjoining the village, and it seems that farming on the sandy links, productive during the stable era of the medieval climate anomaly, had witnessed accelerating erosion in the 14th century. Worse came from stripping of stabilising turf layers and gorse root mats from the adjacent dunes for fuel, soil deepening materials and building needs. Traditional practices wholly out of alignment with the new weather normal and representing the worst kind of cultural rigidity and failure of traditional environmental knowledge. Those practices destabilised the dunes and caused drifting sand that forced abandonment of the village. But despite such examples and the experience of communities from Colburn to Elbottle in the 17th century, persisted past legislation to prevent it in 1685 and 1695. In all cases, from Orkney to the Uist or the North Sea coast, the common denominator was not just continuance of exploitative practices that had developed in better times, but their intensification. Cultivation may have expanded rather than contracted in the later 14th and 15th century as peasant farmers sought to compensate for shortfalls in yields that the deteriorating weather had brought. The consequence of that decision were disastrous. Taken together, all forms of data for the 15th century chart long-term shifts in the weather systems reaching Scotland from the North Atlantic. Such shifts had profound implications for resource exploitation regimes founded on traditional environmental knowledge that had been built up across past centuries. For terrestrial regimes in highland zones, increased rainfall and cooler temperatures affected everything from fuel supply, dominated there by peat, through to meat and milk yields from cattle and yield ratios of cereal crops. Although this may have been offset in part by an increased reliance on more wet and cold-tolerant oat species. Carrying capacities of summer and winter grazing land was affected through reduced biomass production, with more days per annum failing to reach the critical 6 degrees C temperature threshold for grass growth. Whilst recognising that we lack at present any such data from the eastern watershed zones, extrapolation from instrumentally recorded atmospheric and precipitation records in lowland and especially east coast locations suggests that even with the buffering effects of the mountains, the agricultural regime would have faced only moderately better conditions. Here, the same temperature threshold and increased rainfall affected production of less cold and wet-tolerant wheat, again potentially offset by a move to oat cultivation, and may have been in part responsible for the altitudinal drop in cultivation evident in the abandoned field systems in the upland districts of southeast Scotland. Estuarine land brought into agriculture during the peak of the medieval climate anomaly were abandoned in the face of repeated marine transgressions, as evidenced from the district around the head of the Solway Firth in the southwest and the karstlands of the Forth estuary in the east. Lowland districts from Ayr to Elbottle in Lothian or Forvey in Aberdeenshire experienced repeated episodes of dune deflation and sandblow which inundated cultivated ground. In all three cases, this arose from a disastrous interplay of cultivation of calcareous shell sand zones, stripping of turfs from the dune system for anthracite formation in garden plots, animal action, and strengthening of westerly winds attendant on the negative NAO. Human and natural agency delivered a veritable perfect storm. When expressed in human experiential terms, the impact of long-term climate change on the agricultural regime upon which much of Scotland's population subsisted was profound. Even against the backdrop of falling population levels from the middle of the 14th century, the continued downward climatic trend meant that little slack was created in a system that had been poised on a subsistence knife edge since the mid-1200s. It is in this context that we should see the record of increased resort to fast violence in later medieval Scotland, legitimate and illegitimate. characterised or indeed caricatured by the rise of the militarised Highland kindreds with their culture of conspicuous consumption, predation, ritualised raiding and mercenary service. But evident also in the political factionalism of the non-Highland nobility of the 15th century, much of which had competition for resources at its root. Warfare and political instability exacerbated the difficulties, but these were systems more of wider socio-economic dislocation than a cause. In short, people were moving into new relationships of dependency and power, often expressing these relationships in the language of continuity from a near mythical golden age as they negotiated their way through an era of profound environmental transformation. And this is perhaps the greatest significance in closer examination of the Scottish experience. The fact that Scotland as a polity endured despite the multiplicity of insults to its socio-economic metabolism. For very understandable methodological and opportunistic reasons, much of the research effort of the last 3 decades has focused on Greenland and Iceland as laboratories for how complex societies were affected by catastrophic climate change. The historical experience of those lands, it is suggested, provide insight on likely consequences of current climate change. Indeed, they do. But those societies failed or survived only through reduction to dependency at the margins of an external provider. Medieval Scotland, however, was resilient, but with resilience won at significant cost, including successive episodes of profound social reconfiguration in which social dislocation and violence played powerful roles. Yes, Scotland had access to a broader suite of resources, and in comparison to the extremes of climatic deterioration experienced in Greenland, suffered far less dramatic decline in climate and weather conditions. But what differentiates it from Northern Atlantic territories is the record which survives for responses to the palpably negative changes which it endured. At present, however, our understanding of the motors driving change and how these changes were experienced is limited still to headline statements and mainly related to locations on the geographic margins of the medieval kingdom. This skewed national picture has the positive value of elucidating the mechanisms for the transformations evident in the archaeological and paleoenvironmental record of regions otherwise lacking in the documentary sources which elsewhere drive the change narrative. The epiphany in understanding of the social, economic, culture and probably political reconfigurations occasioned in Highland and Hebridean Scotland by the collapse of the regimes that evolved through the medieval climate anomaly, however, is one that has yet to reach most scholars whose research is rooted in the political structures of medieval or early modern Scotland. And now we near the end, with a rapid look forward to the close of the Little Ice Age, and what the transition into the new era of now rapidly accelerating global heating meant. Unlike the medieval climate anomaly, there was no gradual decline and fading out. Instead, the decades from 1810 to 1850 witnessed some of the greatest extremes of cold, precipitation, heat and drought experienced since the 1690s. As with the climate transitions of the LALIA, MCA and earlier LIA, there was probably little immediately evident to the people of Scotland in their daily experience of weather and its impact on their lives that the grim years of the mid and later 1840s had marked a turning point that represented the first step on the road to the conditions we are experiencing today. Successive generations had endured many previous peaks and troughs across the previous 1,300 years, and experience suggested no guarantee of a positive change that would be more than transitory. Based on just the prevailing weather patterns across the 4 decades down to 1850, there was no reason to suppose that improving times for the majority who still lived and worked on the land, or the growing number of town dwellers who were dependent on them to produce their food, lay just ahead. It is only through the rapidly growing volume of instrumentally recorded meteorological data gathered from the 1840s onwards, and from modern analyses of Greenland ice cores and other climate proxy records, that scientists in the later 20th century could see in retrospect that the late 1840s did mark the final extreme episode of what we now label the Little Ice Age. At the time of transition, regardless of whether you had profited or struggled to subsist through that last bitter sting in the tail, there was little discernible difference in weather conditions as Scotland entered the new decade. Winters remained severe and summers unpredictable for many years yet. Given that most of Scotland's people were still rural dwellers and in many parts of the country still primarily employed in working on the land, the climb from the depths of the prolonged cold and high precipitation conditions of previous decades was protracted and for some exceptionally difficult. Even with the continuing expansion of improved farming methods, rapid growth in the use of lime and organic fertilizers, further development of field drainage and plough technology, and experimentation with seed types, harvests in both highland and lowland zones remained variable, and the precarity of the rural economy was a concern for landowners and their tenants alike. The chancy nature of the rural regime was rendered yet more unstable by the rapid expansion of Britain's global imperial trade network and its sources of cheaper and more abundant sources of food and raw materials. Landowners who had pursued profits in wool or who relied on rents from sheep farmers or grain growers looked to pivot rapidly into new modes of working their assets that relied less on livestock and crops and more on the growing demand for access to game shooting and fishing amongst the moneyed classes. Scotland was on the threshold of a new phase in the continuing anthropogenic refashioning of major components of its land and the ecological balances upon it. From our modern vantage point, and unencumbered by those pressures which drove landowners and land users down paths that we now know had no sustainable future, it is too easy to fall into that teleological mindset that sees an almost predetermined trajectory in human actions that lead inevitably to our present environmental position. But such a way of reading the historical record fails to acknowledge the complex interplay of human choices and responses to continuous climatic and wider environmental change. It also fails to recognize that alternative paths were considered, but for various reasons not chosen. Despite the supposed switch to greater negativity that came from the impact of Malthusian theory and the failed experiments of improvement that littered Highland and Lowland Scotland, it can be seen that far from all Scottish landowners and their tenants had become risk-averse. The experience of the 18th and earlier 19th centuries was written in terms of experimental risk-taking. And for many, that continued in the late 19th century, which saw a progressive amelioration in annual mean temperatures as global climate systems moved into a new configuration. In 1850, while Prince Albert and his advisors were still striving to bring into reality the dream of the Great Exhibition, in which the triumphs of modern science and engineering were showcased to the world, most contemporaries, and indeed many modern historians, gave little thought to any associated environmental costs in a project that celebrated human science, reason, and what was seen as the end to the millennia-old struggle to achieve mastery over nature. If any recognized that they had just experienced one of the greatest transitions in human history, they would not have thought in terms of climate and weather. Most educated Victorians saw instead a shift in entirely human terms, in the social order, in political structures or economic systems, providing a human societal exemplar of what from 1859 onwards was understood as Darwinian evolutionary theory. In that human societal shift, pre-existing social tensions and failures of government had been aggravated by that environmental stress and climatic extremities of the 1840s and reached their nadir in the 1848 year of revolutions across Europe. A distressing number of our modern leaders still think in similar terms, despite our heightened awareness of the interplay of anthropogenic and non-anthropogenic factors in shaping our wider environment and daily lived experiences. But the mindset of the ruling classes, captains of industry and scientific community of the early Victorian age was not predisposed to reflect on the environmental context of changes they were witnessing, let alone the environmental consequences of the new order they envisaged. They had the power and the will to change nature, to remodel it as both servant and plaything best organized to meet human needs. To them, scientific endeavor had freed humanity from the age-old struggle to subsist in the face of capricious nature. With hindsight, we can understand their confidence, but also wonder at their folly, for we are now experiencing the extent to which nature, and especially climate, and how we respond to its opportunities and constraints, has made and continues to make human history. Throughout these lectures, it has been the interplay of those factors in the constant reconfiguration of the world around us and our experience of it that has been stressed. That stance has been qualified by recognition throughout that climate was not and is not the sole determinant affecting either human society or the environment in which it functions. As we have seen, however, it was a major factor, and probably the single most important influencing agent, in that changes in mean temperature, precipitation, and storminess affected availability of fuel, restricted or encouraged plant growth, influenced patterns of fish migration, and enhanced or diminished the viability and number of domesticated and wild animals and birds, both directly and indirectly. Centuries of response to changing conditions is evident in the fact that agriculture never entirely failed in even the worst crisis years of the 600s or 1600s, although in some of the most environmentally marginal and economically vulnerable communities, famine, displacement, and death were widespread. Techniques to conserve soil fertility and prevent erosion, albeit through labour-intensive and in some senses environmentally destructive methods that had developed in the later Middle Ages, sustained Scotland's agricultural base through the worst episodes down to the point where new methods adopted by improving tenants removed dependence on those successful but constraining past technologies and practices. As the 1810s, 1820s and 1840s showed, however, the balance of tradition and improvement practice had barely proven sufficient in preventing Scotland from sliding into widespread supply crisis. In essence, in an age where human populations were still largely dependent on solar energy and the resources it delivered on an annual basis, extreme climate change, as experienced in that last phase of the Little Ice Age, was the primary variable affecting human welfare. Yet, it was how human populations chose to respond to those shifting conditions that mattered most. As cultures as diverse as the Greenland Norse and the Hohokam of Arizona and northern Mexico exemplify, dependency traps, cultural rigidity, poor decision-making and failure to adapt sufficiently fast or radically enough to changing conditions led only to what we euphemistically style unfavourable outcomes in times of climate stress. Even during the worst phases in the 15th, 17th and 19th centuries, however, Scotland never suffered the cold, wet or hot, arid extremes that affected Greenland or southwestern North America, and consequently avoided the existential threats that ended cultures whose fundamental structures, from communal behaviours to dietary staples, had been laid down in better times. From the vantage point of 1850, our ancestors surveyed the factors that had delivered a more favourable outcome to Scotland, and ignoring the recurrent subsistence crisis that racked the nation from the 16th century to their own times, or explaining them away in terms of the moral failures of an inferior culture, celebrated the triumphs of Reformation, Revolution, Enlightenment, and Union. Looking across that same span of the Little Ice Age, however, we can better understand that Scotland benefited from a range of human and natural factors that softened the impact of successive subsistence crises. Our ancestors might not have appreciated the relative good fortune, especially during the dearth and disease-ravaged 14th century or the 7 ill years. But geography, topography, and social sophistication enabled a range of responses to novel conditions that allowed many of them to break free from old dependencies. In retrospect, few observers in 1850 could have failed to notice the scale of change wrought in Scotland's environment. Industrialisation would have caught most attention, with the smoke of central Scotland's expanding manufacturing towns and the sprawl of workers' houses signalling the presence of something radically new and unfamiliar. That air of unfamiliarity, however, extended far beyond the zone of urbanisation, for the spreading towns were set amidst a rural pattern that was itself settling into a new prescription of large, enclosed fields and orderly single-tenant farms. Old patterns of unenclosed fields clustered on limited areas of easily cultivable land in which our ancestors had invested centuries of energy had given way in many places to an intrusion of agricultural endeavour that penetrated all but the most intractable reaches of the land. Even those few areas beyond the cultivator's ability were subject to new, more rigorous forms of exploitation, as rough pasture or sporting playground. Lime, phosphate and potassium-enriched fields spread into wetlands and uplands, replacing moss, carr and wet meadows with drained and enclosed arable cultivation. New woodland containing many alien species imported from Britain's expanding overseas empire for their symbolism of global domination as much as their exotic colour and shape or timber value signalled another dramatic adjustment that continued and accelerated a change that had started in the 1670s. Colour and texture would also have struck observers, sometimes jarringly, as draining, liming and soil enrichment adjusted soil chemistry and nutrient availability, leading to richer, lusher and greener grassland, more abundant crops and the capability of the soil to support new and exotic plant life. And as that new agricultural regime spread, so the old landscape and its familiar tones and shapes diminished. But there was no planned uniformity, for Enlightenment and reason presented different solutions for different conditions. In the northeast, fattening cattle studied the park enclosures around the new farms and planned villages, while in the northern highlands sheep displaced cattle and people, with a scattering of shepherds' houses standing amidst the depopulated townships of the rejected mixed farming tradition. That might or might not have been Enlightenment's frontier, for even failure of improvement in much of the Highlands invited alternative responses that were founded on those fundamental Enlightenment principles of reason and usefulness to deliver what were believed to be optimal outcomes for all parties involved, albeit applied with inhuman rigour and inhumane cost. And already by 1850, that very recent transition was itself yielding to a newer, utterly pragmatic prescription where great tracts of land were emptied of both the remaining people and the recently introduced sheep, to be reserved as a deer forest in which a privileged few could hunt for a few weeks each year. Improvement in a lowland sense might have reached the end of the road in the Highlands by the 1820s, but practicality, pragmatism, and rationality still had decades of course to run. It is the interconnectedness of human cultures and global environment, and the evidence for the lived experience of ordinary people that has been the central dynamic of these lectures that points to the significance of the environmental turn in historical research as a way to humanize and illustrate in accessible terms much of the still abstract discourse surrounding climate change. Traditional historical and archaeological methodologies and models limit the active engagement of many academic specialists in contemporary climate change debates. We need to see more interdisciplinary syntheses of environmental data from historical record, archaeological and paleological sources from Scotland to build on those that are now transforming our understanding of political, social, economic and cultural change across the pre-modern North Atlantic and the European Atlantic regions more generally. Too much, however, remains focused on the micro rather than macro scales, or on failed or completed experiments like 10th to 15th century Greenland. Certainly, such sources are supplying increasingly high-resolution environmental data in terms of both temporal and geographic precision, and creating a much more nuanced and multifaceted understanding of the intersection of environments, mentalities, culture, economics, and politics in the historic past. But the disjunction between the historic communities who functioned within their limits and the modern communities that now occupy the same zones constitutes a telling weakness in arguments about how environmental history and archaeology can deliver valuable insights for application in current climate change modelling. No matter how robust the interdisciplinary research which draws together such data, or how transformative the multivariable modelling of past trends and their ecological and human impacts has been, the inescapable bottom line is that the society under scrutiny in Greenland failed. Elsewhere around the North Atlantic periphery, and especially in countries like Scotland, where unbroken sequences of land use records, paleoenvironmental profiles, and climate proxy data link the early medieval cultures directly to their modern successors, we have continuing experiments that do permit us to investigate the circumstances that establish resilience and delivered sustainable practices across successive waves of profound climate change. Even here, however, the focus remains on what in modern core periphery terms are outlying areas, albeit ones that in the Middle Ages were hubs of international trade, within networks that extended from the Baltic and Mediterranean to the Greenland colonies. While their experience perhaps comes closer to providing models for societies that benefited from a broader suite of environmental resources and which had consequently greater ranges of choice in how to respond to climate change, they were still non-urban and pre-industrial in their socioeconomic and political structures. The challenge for us, then, is to shift our focus onto a still living experiment and present evidence that contributes in formulating answers to questions around cultural limits to adaptation and social limits to change in a complex and globally connected society. Thank you.